History books have long told a simple story about our connected world. They describe a clear line drawn in the sand in the year 1492, when continents previously separated suddenly met. This post-Columbian narrative is comforting in its order, but it is crumbling. A quiet revolution is unfolding not in libraries, but in the dirt, as archaeologists unearth objects that simply do not belong. These are not fringe fantasies, they are tangible puzzles that force a complete rethinking of our past. By the end of this exploration, you will have seen 20 pieces of a new, more mysterious global timeline. How did a Roman artifact end up sealed beneath an ancient Mexican city, and whose coins lie scattered from the coasts of California to the castles of Japan? Each discovery asks us to reconsider a fundamental question. What if our ancient ancestors were far more curious and connected than we ever dared to believe? Standing quietly in a Newport park is a structure that should not exist. The Newport Tower rises from the ground as a circular stone cylinder, its arches and columns looking distinctly, undeniably medieval. To any casual observer, it appears as if a small piece of a European castle or a monastery chapel was lifted from the old world and carefully set down in New England centuries ago. And according to the official history, that is precisely the problem. The established narrative tells us that European settlement here began with the Puritans in the 1600s. Yet this tower, built from local stone and fieldstone, exhibits architectural features that whisper of a much older world. Its 8 cylindrical columns and rounded arches bear a striking resemblance to structures from the Norse era or to Portuguese designs from the Age of Exploration, long before the Mayflower ever sailed. For generations, the most accepted theory was a practical one, that it was simply the ruined base of a 17th-century windmill built by an early colonial governor. This explanation offers a tidy, logical answer, but the tower itself refuses to be so easily catalogued. The mystery deepened dramatically when scientific analysis entered the conversation. Researchers performed carbon dating on organic materials found within the tower's mortar. The results were astonishing. The dates returned suggested the mortar could have been mixed as early as the 1400s, potentially placing its construction well before any recorded English colony. This finding sent shockwaves through the historical community. If the dating is accurate, it means someone with knowledge of sophisticated European stone masonry was building permanent, ceremonial structures on the American coast decades, perhaps even a century before Columbus. The debate is fierce. Skeptics argue the carbon-dated materials could be from older limestone used in the mortar, not from the construction event itself. They point to colonial records that seem to reference the tower as a mill. Proponents of the pre-Columbian theory counter with the architecture itself, asking why a colonial governor would build a windmill that so closely mimics a European baptistry or a Templar church. Every stone in the Newport Tower is a question. Is it the forgotten outpost of a lost Portuguese expedition, a landmark built by Norse explorers venturing south from Vinland, or is it indeed just an unusually fancy colonial windmill? What makes this more than an academic argument is its physical challenge to our timeline. It is not a coin that could have been traded or lost, it is a building. Its presence suggests not a fleeting visit, but an intention to stay, a declaration made in stone that someone from across the Atlantic was here, and they built something to last. This tower does not ask for our attention with grandeur. It simply stands, a silent and stubborn sentinel guarding a secret from the edge of recorded history. The quiet defiance of stone is a theme that echoes across the continent. Far from the Atlantic coast, in the rich soil of a Minnesota farm, another stone spoke, and its message was written in a language no one in the area should have known. In the autumn of 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Åman was clearing tree roots from his field. As he wrestled with a stubborn aspen, his axe struck something solid. What he unearthed was a large, rectangular slab of grey-wacky stone, roughly 200 pounds, its face covered in strange, angular carvings. The local community was baffled, but Åman, recognizing the characters from his homeland, identified them as runes. This was the Kensington Runestone, and its inscription would ignite one of the most heated and enduring historical debates in American archaeology. The runic text tells a harrowing story of exploration and tragedy. Translated, it reads as a dated record from an expedition. It states in part that 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on a journey from Vinland far to the west had made camp here. The inscription goes on to describe a terrible day, noting that 10 men were lost, and ends with a plea for rescue. Most astonishingly, it is clearly dated. The carvings declare the year to be 1362, 170 years after the famous Viking settlement at Elance Ork's Meadows, and nearly 130 years before Columbus. If genuine, this slab of stone was a dire message in a bottle, left deep in the heart of North America by Norse travelers who had journeyed far inland from their coastal settlements. From the moment of its discovery, the stone was met with fierce skepticism. Prominent scholars immediately denounced it as an elaborate hoax, likely crafted by Åman or other Scandinavian immigrants with knowledge of runes. They pointed to apparent anachronisms in the language, suggesting the runic forms were a mix of styles from different periods. The very idea of a Norse party traveling so far inland to Minnesota seemed to many a geographical fantasy. For decades, the academic establishment dismissed the stone as a curious forgery, a piece of folk art born from immigrant nostalgia, but the stone refused to be silenced. As decades passed, new generations of researchers applied modern techniques to the mystery. Geologists examined the weathering of the inscription, noting that the carved lines showed signs of mineral deposits and erosion consistent with centuries of exposure, not a few years. Linguists revisited the runes, with some arguing that the mixed style could reflect the natural evolution of language in an isolated Scandinavian community over generations. Perhaps most compelling were the details within the text itself. The inscription uses specific, obscure numbering systems and phrasing that scholars argue would have been unknown to a 19th-century farmer. It describes the location with a precision that, while strange, aligns with known Norse navigation practices. The significance of the Kensington Runestone, if authentic, is profound. It proposes not just a fleeting coastal visit, but a purposeful expedition into the continental interior. It suggests that Norse exploration in the New World did not end with the abandonment of Vinland, but may have continued in fits and starts for centuries, with groups venturing down rivers and across the Great Lakes. This stone is a potential pivot point, extending the timeline of European presence in America and hinting at a much more ambitious and ultimately tragic chapter of pre-Columbian contact. It stands as a stark, runic question mark carved in rock, a ghostly whisper from a forest clearing that challenges us to reconsider who was here and when their story truly began. A single coin can hold an entire ocean of possibility. In 1957, at a significant archaeological site on the central coast of Maine known as the Goddard Site, researchers sifted through layers of earth that told a long story of Native American life. The site was a major trading hub for the Penobscot Nation, a place where tools, materials, and ideas were exchanged for centuries. Among the thousands of artifacts uncovered, one item stood out as utterly, inexplicably foreign. It was a small, worn silver coin. After careful examination by numismatists, experts in currency, it was identified without doubt. This was a Norwegian penny, a Norse coin minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, dating it firmly to between 1065 and 1080. This was not a replica or a modern souvenir. It was a genuine artifact from 11th century Scandinavia, resting in soil on the other side of the Atlantic. The Maine Penny, as it became known, is a paradox of scale. It is one of the smallest pieces of evidence for pre-Columbian contact ever found, yet its implications are vast. Its authenticity is not in question. The debate and the true mystery revolves entirely around its journey. How did this specific coin travel from a Norse mint to a Native American settlement in Maine? Scholars have proposed several pathways, each telling a different story about the nature of early global connection. The first and most direct theory is that Norse explorers themselves brought the coin to the area. We know from the settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland that the Norse were active in the North Atlantic around the year 1000. Could a party have sailed south along the coast, eventually making contact and trading this coin to the indigenous people of Maine? It is a compelling, straightforward narrative, but it lacks supporting evidence. No other Norse artifacts have been found at the Goddard site, making this coin a solitary outlier. The second, and currently more favored explanation, involves the incredible scale and endurance of indigenous trade networks. The peoples of the Americas were not isolated tribes. They were part of complex, continent-spanning systems of exchange that moved goods over astonishing distances. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains has been found in Ohio. Copper from the Great Lakes has been found in the southeast. It is entirely plausible, even likely, that the Maine Penny arrived not from a Norse ship, but through a long, slow chain of hand-to-hand trade. A Norse item, perhaps left behind in Newfoundland or acquired through a brief encounter there, could have been picked up by indigenous traders. Over generations, as a curious and valued object, it traveled southward through these established networks, hundreds of miles from its point of origin, until it finally came to rest in Maine. This theory does not diminish the coin's significance. Instead, it amplifies it, showcasing the incredible reach and connectivity of pre-Columbian societies. A third, more skeptical possibility is that the coin was a later intrusion, accidentally dropped at the site by a modern collector or even planted as a hoax. However, the meticulous documentation of its discovery by professional archaeologists, found within a layer of undisturbed, datable material, makes this explanation the least likely. The Maine Penny's power lies in its tangible simplicity. It is not a mysterious tower or a debatable runic inscription. It is a common piece of currency, a dime of its day, lost far from home. It asks us to hold two ideas in our minds at once. It confirms that Norse material did reach the shores of the Americas. Yet it also suggests that the most profound journeys may not have been made by explorers in ships, but by objects passing from hand to hand, traveling silently along the ancient highways of a continent, weaving a single thread of silver into a much larger and still unfolding human story. But the whispers of distant travelers were not confined to the northern forests. In the late 1880s, as America was rapidly industrializing, a team of researchers from the Smithsonian Institution was excavating a Native American burial mound in eastern Tennessee, near a place called Bat Creek. Within the mound, they uncovered a collection of artifacts alongside the remains of several individuals, a ceremonial site typical of the region's ancient history. Among these items was a small, flat stone about the length of a person's hand, with a series of strange markings carefully inscribed on its surface. At the time, the leading researcher, Cyrus Thomas, concluded the script was likely a form of Cherokee writing, a conclusion that seemed logical and kept the object within a known historical framework. The Bat Creek stone, as it was catalogued, was then placed in a museum drawer where it sat quietly for decades, a minor mystery considered solved. Its story, however, was far from over. Nearly a century later, in the 1970s, the stone was re-examined by a researcher named Cyrus Gordon, a scholar of ancient Mediterranean languages. What he saw turned the established interpretation on its head. Gordon argued forcefully that the inscriptions were not Cherokee at all. He identified them as Paleo-Hebrew, a script used in the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah around the 1st or 2nd century. Even more astonishing was his proposed translation. He read the 5 characters as spelling out a phrase meaning, for Judah, a possible dedication or identifier. If this interpretation was correct, the implications were staggering. It suggested that individuals familiar with a script from the ancient Near East had not only reached the American continent, but had been present in the Appalachian region over 1,000 years before Columbus and nearly 2,000 years before documented European settlement there. The academic world reacted with intense skepticism, and a fierce debate erupted that continues to this day. Critics of the Paleo-Hebrew theory point to several major issues. They argue the inscription is crude and could be a modern forgery, perhaps created in the 19th century when interest in both ancient mysteries and Hebrew lore was high. They note that the original excavator did not recognize it as Hebrew and suggest the markings could be random indigenous symbols or even natural cracks that resemble letters. The stone's provenance, while documented, is not immune to question, as archaeological practices in the 1880s were less rigorous than today. The idea of a transatlantic voyage from the Mediterranean world in antiquity, while not impossible, lacks any corroborating evidence from other sites in the region. Proponents, however, counter with intriguing points. They highlight that the specific form of Paleo-Hebrew identified on the stone is a very specialized knowledge, unlikely to have been known by a potential forger in rural Tennessee at that time. They also point to forensic studies conducted in the late 20th century, which examined the stone's patina, the natural film that forms on its surface over time. These analyses suggested the inscription's grooves showed weathering consistent with great age, implying the carving was ancient and not a recent addition. The stone's context, found within a securely dated burial mound, adds a layer of complexity that is hard to dismiss outright. The Bat Creek stone forces a difficult choice. It is either one of the most profound archaeological discoveries in the Americas, a direct material link to the ancient Old World, or it is an elaborate and perplexing hoax that has fooled observers for over a century. There is little comfortable middle ground. This small stone carries an immense weight of possibility. If genuine, it does not just imply a chance shipwreck. The phrase, for Judah, hints at identity, at a group purposefully carrying their language and perhaps their culture across an ocean. It opens a door to a history so radical it rewrites our understanding of global mobility, suggesting the threads of human connection across the seas were spun far earlier and were far more diverse than our textbooks ever allowed. It remains a cipher, a handful of carved characters holding a secret that could either be a key to a lost world or a masterful puzzle with no solution. While the Bat Creek stone whispers of a possible ancient Near Eastern presence, another inscription discovered far to the south shouts a detailed story of maritime adventure. In 1872, on a plantation near the Paraíba River in Brazil, a landowner reportedly unearthed a heavy stone slab. Its surface was covered not with random marks, but with a coherent, elegantly carved text in a script that looked nothing like any known indigenous writing. When experts were finally able to examine it, they identified the language as Phoenician, the script of the famed seafaring merchants from the coast of the ancient Mediterranean. The translation, however, was what sent minds reeling. The text presented itself as a first-person account by a captain describing a harrowing voyage. It told of a fleet of 10 ships that had set out from a port on the Red Sea, a journey commissioned by a Phoenician king. After being separated from their companions in a great storm at sea, the surviving vessel, under the command of this captain, had sailed for years, eventually making landfall on this distant, unknown shore. The inscription ended with a solemn dedication and a plea for remembrance, a message in a bottle carved not in glass but in enduring stone. If genuine, the Paraíba inscription was not merely evidence of contact. It was a pre-Columbian logbook, a detailed narrative claiming that Phoenician sailors had successfully crossed the Atlantic over 2,000 years before Columbus, in the 6th century before the Common Era. The academic establishment of the late 19th century reacted with swift and total dismissal. The stone itself had mysteriously vanished shortly after its discovery, leaving only a copy of the inscription for study. Without the original artifact to authenticate, scholars branded it an obvious forgery. They argued that knowledge of the Phoenician language and script was available in Brazil at the time, and that the story was simply too fantastical, too perfectly aligned with romantic notions of lost explorers. The case was considered closed, a curious footnote in the history of archaeological hoaxes. For nearly a century, the Paraíba inscription was relegated to the fringe, a tale told more by enthusiasts than by serious historians. But the story refused to die. In the late 20th century, linguists with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of ancient Semitic languages revisited the available transcription of the text. Their findings were startling. They noted subtle grammatical constructs and archaic word forms within the inscription that were not known to 19th century scholarship. These were nuances a forger of that era would have been incapable of reproducing. The script itself displayed phonetic shifts and stylistic details authentic to the specific time period it claimed to originate from. In essence, the very details that made the text complex were the very details that now argued for its authenticity. It was as if someone had written a perfect, idiomatic sentence in a dialect that scholars had only fully decoded decades later. The implications of a verified Paraíba inscription are nothing short of revolutionary for the timeline of global contact. The Phoenicians were not mythic figures, they were historical reality, the Mediterranean's greatest ancient mariners. Their sturdy ships powered by sail and oar established trade colonies from North Africa to Spain. They are credibly believed to have circumnavigated Africa. For them, the Atlantic was not a barrier of legend but the next horizon. This inscription suggests they may have found what lay beyond it. It proposes a deliberate, organized expedition, not a drift voyage reaching the coast of Brazil. Such a contact would have been fleeting, likely ending with the eventual loss or assimilation of the crew, leaving behind no lasting colony but perhaps a profound cultural echo. Could elements of Mesoamerican mythology that speak of bearded gods arriving from the east trace their roots to such an encounter? The possibility forces us to re-evaluate the flow of ideas. It asks if the seeds of certain old world concepts in technology or astronomy could have been carried across the ocean and nurtured in new soil long before the age of empire. The Paraíba stone, whether a magnificent truth or an impossibly clever deception, stands as a direct challenge. It represents the ultimate pre-Columbian claim, not of a lost coin or a single artifact, but of a fully articulated voice from the ancient world, claiming to have done the very thing we long believed impossible. The power of a single carved face can stop time. In the dry highlands of central Mexico, at the ancient Toltec site of Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca, archaeologists in the 1930s were carefully excavating a burial that dated to the pre-Columbian era, long before any European arrival. Within this undisturbed context, sealed beneath layers of earth and history, they uncovered a small terracotta artifact that seemed to defy all logic. It was the head of a bearded man, no larger than a few inches tall, but its features were unmistakable. The figure wore a distinct style of cap known as a pileus, and his hair and facial structure bore a striking, undeniable resemblance to classical Roman portraiture. This was not a stylized representation of a local deity or a ruler. It looked for all the world like a Roman artifact from the Mediterranean, yet it rested in a grave in Mexico, thousands of miles and an entire ocean away from where it belonged. The discovery was so incongruous that for years it was quietly catalogued and set aside, a puzzle too difficult to solve with the tools of the time. The official history of the Americas had no place for a Roman head in a Toltec grave. The most convenient explanation was that it must be a mistake, perhaps a later intrusion from the colonial period that had somehow contaminated the ancient layer. This assumption provided a comfortable answer, allowing the established timeline to remain intact, but the artifact itself refused to conform to this neat narrative. Decades later, in the 1990s, scientists applied a definitive test to the terracotta head. They used a method called thermoluminescence dating, which measures the last time the clay was fired in a kiln. The results were conclusive and shocking. The head was dated to somewhere between the 9th and the 13th century. This placed its creation firmly within the pre-Columbian period, centuries before any Spanish contact, and even well after the classical Roman Empire had fallen in Europe. This tiny terracotta head now posed an enormous question. How could an object displaying such clear Roman artistic influence end up in a sealed burial in central Mexico, possibly as early as the 9th century? The debate that followed split into several compelling and contentious schools of thought. The first and most dramatic theory is one of direct transatlantic contact. Proponents suggest that a Roman vessel, perhaps blown off course, could have made the arduous journey across the Atlantic. There is historical precedent for Roman seafaring capability. They traded extensively across the Indian Ocean and are known to have ventured into the Atlantic along the coast of Africa. Could a storm-driven ship have reached the Gulf of Mexico, with survivors or their belongings eventually making their way inland? This head, then, might be a rare relic of that forgotten voyage, perhaps crafted by a local artist who encountered these strange visitors. A second theory seeks a less extraordinary pathway. It posits that the Roman stylistic elements could have traveled to the Americas not through direct voyage, but through a long, slow chain of cultural diffusion. Artistic ideas can travel astonishing distances through trade networks. Could a Roman artifact or the image of one have moved across Asia into Siberia and down the Pacific coast of the Americas over many generations? Its origin story lost but its form still copied by local artisans. This theory stretches the limits of artistic transmission but offers a way to explain the head without a single, improbable sea crossing. The skeptical view remains that the head is an anomaly or a later intrusion, despite the thermoluminescence date. Critics argue the date could have an error margin, or that the artifact, while old, was somehow placed into the older burial layer at a later time. They point out that no other Roman artifacts have been found in the region, making this head a profound but solitary outlier. Yet its sealed archaeological context makes this skeptical argument increasingly difficult to maintain. The Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head is not a story found in a book. It is a physical object that should not exist where it does, verified by modern science. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the map of the ancient world was not a collection of isolated circles, but a web with threads we are only beginning to perceive. This small, silent face from the earth asks us a simple, profound question. If this is real, what else have we missed? Off the fog-shrouded coast of California, the Pacific Ocean guards a secret in its silent depths. In the 1970s, commercial fishermen working the waters near Palos Verdes began hauling up strange, massive objects tangled in their nets. These were not natural rock formations. They were large, meticulously crafted stone rings, some weighing hundreds of pounds, with a distinct groove carved around their circumference. To maritime archaeologists, their design was instantly recognizable. They were ancient anchors, identical in form to the stone anchors used for centuries by Chinese sailing junks. The immediate and thrilling question was obvious. What were anchors from ancient China doing on the seafloor of North America? thousands of miles from where any known Chinese ship was supposed to have sailed. The discovery ignited a theory that connected these stones to one of history's greatest and most mysterious mariners, Admiral Zheng He. In the early 15th century, decades before Columbus, Zheng He commanded a colossal treasure fleet for China's Ming dynasty. His enormous ships, some reportedly over 400 feet long, dwarfed European vessels of the era. His 7 epic voyages stretched across the Indian Ocean, reaching the coast of Africa and establishing China as a preeminent naval power. Historical records of these voyages end there, but tantalizing gaps and legends have long suggested the fleet's ambitions may have been even grander. Could Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleet have continued east across the Pacific, reaching the coastline of the Americas? The California anchors seem to offer physical proof. Proponents of this theory pointed to the stones themselves. Geological analysis determined the rock was not local to California. It was a type of sandstone found in China. The specific design, with its central hole and surrounding groove, was a signature of Chinese maritime engineering used to secure heavy ropes. The location, found in a cluster, suggested a fleet anchoring together, not a single lost vessel. It painted a picture of a planned, large-scale expedition making landfall on the western shores of a new continent. The implications were staggering, suggesting a complete reorientation of the discovery narrative from east-west to west-east. However, as with all profound claims, robust counterarguments emerged. Skeptics proposed a more mundane, though historically documented, explanation. The 19th century saw a massive influx of Chinese immigrants to California during the Gold Rush and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. These immigrants often sailed on traditional Chinese junks. These ships, like all vessels of the era, used ballast-heavy material placed in the hold to ensure stability. What if these ring stones were not ancient anchors at all, but simply ballast stones from those 19th century ships, discarded overboard when the ships arrived in port and no longer needed the weight? This explanation fits the known historical timeline perfectly and requires no trans-Pacific voyage in the 1400s. The debate hinges on a difficult archaeological puzzle, distinguishing an anchor from a ballast stone after centuries underwater. True anchors show specific wear patterns from ropes, and their placement on the seafloor can indicate how a ship was positioned. Ballast stones are typically unmodified and dumped in a pile. The California stones, worn by time and tide, have offered ambiguous evidence. Some show the classic groove wear, others do not. Their scattered location could support either a deliberate anchorage or a disposal site. This mystery lies in the tension between an extraordinary possibility and a logical, ordinary explanation. It asks us to weigh the scale of Zheng He's lost legacy against the practical realities of a more recent migration. Whether these stones are 15th century anchors or 19th century ballast, they are undeniable artifacts of Chinese maritime technology on the American coast. They serve as a material bridge across the Pacific, a reminder that the ocean has always been a highway, not a wall, and that the currents of human movement have carried ideas and objects in ways we are still struggling to fully chart. The vast Pacific is not the only ocean whose currents carry whispers of distant shores. Deep in the humid lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, a different kind of stone testament gazes silently across the centuries. Here, the ancient Olmec civilization, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, left behind a mystery carved in monumental scale, the colossal stone heads. These are not mere sculptures, they are portraits in basalt, some standing over 9 feet tall and weighing more than 20 tons. Each one is a unique individual, wearing a distinctive helmet-like headdress with broad features, full lips, and wide, commanding expressions. They were carved over 3,000 years ago, an astonishing feat of engineering and artistry from one of the America's earliest complex societies. Yet for many modern observers, the most striking aspect is not their size, but their faces. To some eyes, these visages appear distinctly different from later Mesoamerican art, featuring characteristics that sparked a controversial and enduring theory. Could there have been an ancient African presence in the Americas? The idea did not emerge from archaeology initially, but from a visual impression. When these heads were first brought to wider attention in the 20th century, observers noted the sculpture's broad noses, full lips, and the realistic, individualized features. To some, these traits seem to align more closely with physical features associated with African populations than with the indigenous peoples of the region. This observation gave rise to a diffusionist theory, suggesting that voyagers from Africa might have crossed the Atlantic in antiquity, influencing or even founding the Olmec civilization. Proponents pointed to perceived similarities in artistic styles and speculated about ocean currents that could facilitate such a journey. The heads, in this view, became stone portraits of actual African visitors or rulers, immortalized by a culture they helped shape. Mainstream archaeology, however, presents a very different and strongly evidenced narrative. The consensus among scholars who study the Olmec is that these magnificent works are purely indigenous creations, representing Olmec rulers or elites. The stylistic choices are seen as a local artistic tradition, one that emphasized naturalism and individuality for powerful figures. The basalt itself was quarried from local mountains and transported with immense effort, a testament to Olmec social organization and their desire to permanently honor their leaders. The physical features depicted are understood as part of the natural diversity within ancient Mesoamerican populations, not as evidence of external contact. Genetic and archaeological studies of the region show continuity of settlement and development without signs of a sudden, foreign influx that would correspond with such a theory. The Olmec heads, therefore, are celebrated as a powerful symbol of independent cultural achievement in the Americas. This debate highlights a crucial point about how we interpret the past. The Olmec heads are not direct evidence of transoceanic contact like a coin or an anchor. No African artifact has been found in an Olmec site. Instead, the heads act as a perceptual challenge. They force us to confront our own assumptions about what ancient Americans should have looked like and about the capacity for independent innovation. The theory of African influence, while not supported by the archaeological record, emerged from a desire to connect human histories across vast divides, to find a familiar thread in an unfamiliar tapestry. In doing so, it underscores a profound truth. These sculptures possess a powerful, almost universal humanity that speaks across millennia. They remind us that artifacts can rewrite timelines not only by proving contact, but by challenging our perceptions so deeply that we are compelled to re-examine the very stories we tell about cultural isolation and the beautiful, mysterious diversity of the ancient world. Peat holds memories like no other soil. In the wetlands of Somerset, England, a remarkable wooden pathway was uncovered, a meticulously engineered trackway built by Neolithic farmers to cross the marshy ground. Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, gave this ancient structure a breathtakingly precise birthday. The trees used to build it were felled in the year 3807 before the Common Era. This is the Sweet Track, a walkway from a time when Stonehenge was still centuries from being conceived, a tangible line connecting us to a world nearly 6,000 years in the past. During its excavation in the 1970s, archaeologists carefully sifted through the preserving peat. Deep within the waterlogged layers that had sealed the track since its construction, they made a find that defied all logic. It was a small, corroded metal disc. After cleaning, it revealed itself to be a coin, not a primitive token, but a sophisticated Roman coin, specifically an Antoninianus from the 3rd century. The date was unmistakable. This coin was minted over 4,000 years after the sweet track was built. Here was a chronological impossibility, a Roman artifact sitting in a sealed Neolithic context, a clear and puzzling violation of the fundamental archaeological rule that objects found in a layer must be from the time that layer was formed. The immediate conclusion might be that the dating was wrong or the excavation was flawed, but the science was sound. The sweet track's date is one of the most secure in all of European prehistory. The coin's identification was certain. This left only one rational explanation. The coin had arrived in that ancient layer at a much later date. But how does a 3rd century Roman object bury itself 4,000 years down into a peat bog that had been closed for millennia? Several fascinating hypotheses attempt to solve this riddle, each a lesson in how the Earth can sometimes shuffle its own history. The first theory involves a Roman-era collector or traveler, perhaps a Roman soldier or a local inhabitant, walking across the same wetlands centuries later, dropped the coin. Through natural processes, the coin could have slowly sunk through the soft, wet peat over the course of centuries, eventually settling down beside the much older timbers. Peat is a dynamic, living medium. It grows, compresses, and shifts. An object can migrate vertically through it, creating a false association between artifacts from wildly different eras. A second, more dramatic possibility is geological. The Somerset levels have experienced periods of flooding, drying, and human alteration over the centuries. Could a later flood or a sudden shift in the bog structure have opened a fissure, allowing the coin to tumble down into the prehistoric layer before the Earth sealed itself again? This would be a rare event, but not an impossible one, a geological accident that placed two disconnected moments of history into intimate, misleading contact. There is also the simpler, human element of loss. Could the coin have been dropped by a medieval or even later antiquarian, someone who had found it elsewhere and was exploring the bog, leaving it to be found in a place it never truly belonged? The sweet track coin is a masterclass in archaeological humility. It is a stark reminder that the stratigraphic layers we rely on to tell time can sometimes lie, not out of malice, but through the slow, patient work of nature and the unpredictable actions of people long gone. This single coin did not rewrite the timeline of early global contact, but it did rewrite our understanding of certainty. It shows that an artifact out of place is not always a door to a forgotten voyage. Sometimes it is a lesson in patience, a warning against jumping to conclusions, and a testament to the complex, layered story that every inch of Earth contains. Sometimes the past reveals itself not in a single artifact, but in an entire sunken world. In the deep blue waters off the coast of southern Turkey, near the point known as Ulu Burun, a sponge diver in the 1980s noticed something strange on the seafloor. It was not a natural rock formation, but the ghostly outline of a ship's hull, and around it, a field of ancient cargo scattered like a lost king's treasury. This was the Ulu Burun shipwreck, a time capsule from the late Bronze Age, dating to around 1,300 years before the Common Era. It was a discovery that did not speak of a new world, but of a stunningly interconnected old one, a world whose economic web was far more vast and complex than anyone had dared to believe. The ship itself was a merchant vessel, likely from the Canaanite or Cypriot world, a wooden skeleton preserved in the sediment, but its true story was told by what it carried. As archaeologists meticulously recovered its contents, they catalogued a cargo list that read like an atlas of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. There were 10 tons of raw copper ingots from Cyprus, the essential ingredient for Bronze Age technology. Alongside them were ingots of tin, likely sourced from as far away as Afghanistan or even Cornwall in Britain, the other vital component for making bronze. There was a ton of terebinth resin, a valuable perfume ingredient packed in Canaanite jars. There were logs of precious ebony wood from Africa, raw ivory from elephant tusks, and cobalt blue glass ingots from Mesopotamia. The personal belongings of the crew and traders told an equally cosmopolitan tale. There were seals and scarabs from Egypt, gold jewelry from the Levant, a stone ceremonial mace from the Balkans, and even amber beads that originated in the distant Baltic Sea. This single ship was a floating microcosm of a globalized economy over 3,000 years ago. The significance of Ulu Burun is revolutionary because it rewrites the timeline of international trade. Before its discovery, historians understood that Bronze Age kingdoms traded, but they imagined it as a slow, cautious, piecemeal process, a trickle of goods along coastlines. The Ulu Burun wreck shattered that image. Here was evidence of a direct, long-distance maritime route, a ship carrying a planned, high-value cargo from a dozen different cultures simultaneously. It proved that a merchant in the 14th century BC could load a ship with Cypriot copper, Mesopotamian glass, African ivory, and Baltic amber, intending to sail it to a specific port for exchange. This was not simple barter between neighbors, it was sophisticated, speculative commerce on an industrial scale. It reveals a world where royal palaces, from Egypt to Mycenaean Greece to the Hittite Empire, were connected by a robust and regular network of professional merchants who crossed political and cultural boundaries as a matter of routine. The ship's voyage also hints at the fragile nature of this early globalization. It likely sank in a storm while traveling a well-established route along the Anatolian coast, a reminder that the wealth of empires and the flow of ideas depended on the skill of sailors and the mercy of the weather. Its loss was a tragedy for its owners, but an unparalleled gift to us, freezing a single moment of exchange in time. The Ulu Burun shipwreck forces us to zoom out. It shows that the desire to connect, to trade, to acquire the rare and the beautiful is a human impulse as ancient as civilization itself. Long before the Silk Road, the Mediterranean was its own swirling hub of international traffic. This sunken vessel does not ask who discovered America. It asks us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the ambition and reach of our earliest global ancestors. It proves that the world was already woven together by threads of commerce and curiosity, threads that reached across continents and seas, waiting for us to find their tangled, glorious ends. The intricate trade networks of the Bronze Age reveal a world already hungry for distant luxuries. But what if those networks stretched even further than we ever imagined, carrying not just copper and glass, but plants that could alter the mind? In the 1990s, a scientific finding emerged that struck at the very heart of accepted history, all stemming from a series of quiet, clinical tests performed on ancient Egyptian mummies. A German toxicologist named Svetlana Balabanova was conducting routine hair and tissue analyses on mummified individuals from museums, searching for traces of known medicinal or ritual substances. Her results, however, were anything but routine. Within the preserved remains, her team identified the unmistakable chemical signatures of two powerful compounds, cocaine and nicotine. On the surface, this seems like a curious anomaly, but the historical implications are seismic. Both cocaine and nicotine are derived from plants native exclusively to the Americas. The coca plant, source of cocaine, grows in the Andes. Tobacco, source of nicotine, is a product of the New World. According to all established timelines, these continents had no contact with Egypt until after Columbus. Yet here was hard, analytical chemistry claiming these substances were present in bodies that had been sealed away for millennia, long before the Common Era. The methodology was sophisticated, using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, techniques considered the gold standard for identifying specific chemical compounds. The samples were taken directly from the mummy's hair, skin, and bone, materials less susceptible to external contamination than wrappings or soil. The findings were published, and a firestorm of academic debate immediately erupted. The scientific and historical communities divided into starkly opposed camps. Skeptics launched a vigorous counter-argument centered on the possibility of contamination. Could the mummies, stored in museum basements for over a century, have been exposed to these substances? Perhaps 19th century curators, who sometimes used nicotine as a pesticide or handled specimens with contaminated hands, introduced the compounds. Others suggested that the tests themselves might have produced a false positive, detecting molecular structures that merely resembled cocaine or nicotine but came from unknown and now extinct Old World plants. This is a compelling point. The ancient world was full of flora we have lost. Could there have been an African or Asian plant that produced similar alkaloids? Proponents of the findings, however, found the contamination theory insufficient. They argued that the compounds were detected deep within the hair shafts and tissue, not just on the surface, suggesting they were metabolized by the individual while alive. The idea that multiple mummies from different collections would all be contaminated in the same specific, internal way seemed statistically unlikely. This line of reasoning leads to the radical, breathtaking possibility that there was a pre-Columbian transatlantic trade in psychoactive plants. Imagine a network not of bulk goods but of rare, precious botanicals. Could a trickle of coca leaves or tobacco have been passed along a chain of intermediaries, traversing the Atlantic through unknown means, perhaps via Phoenician traders or a lost current-driven voyage, to eventually reach the pharmacies or ritual specialists of ancient Egypt? The substances would have been incredibly valuable, reserved for elites or sacred ceremonies, explaining their rarity in the archaeological record. The cocaine mummies present us with a perfect dilemma. We are forced to choose between two extraordinary propositions. Either our scientific techniques are detecting ghosts of lost Old World plants, a botanical mystery that rewrites natural history, or our map of ancient global exchange is missing a major transoceanic route dedicated to the most sought-after commodities of all, those that could transcend ordinary consciousness. This isn't just about trade routes, it's about the universal human quest for experience, a quest that may have built bridges across worlds we thought were forever apart. A world apart can sometimes feel hauntingly familiar. On the coast of Ecuador, archaeologists uncovered delicate clay figurines crafted by the ancient Valdivia culture, a society that flourished over 5,000 years ago. These small, stylized human figures, with their simple yet expressive forms, are among the earliest known pottery in the Americas. To the untrained eye, they are beautiful artifacts of a local tradition. But to a researcher in the 1960s named Emilio Estrada, they sparked a startling recognition. He saw in their coiled clay bodies, their hairstyles, and their postures an uncanny mirror image of pottery being made at the very same time, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, by the Jōmon culture of prehistoric Japan. The resemblance was so profound it seemed to defy coincidence, launching the bold and controversial Jōmon-Valdivia theory. This idea proposed that ancient Japanese fishermen, carried by the powerful Kuroshio current, had made a trans-Pacific voyage to the shores of South America, bringing their distinctive pottery style with them and influencing the birth of ceramic art in the New World. The evidence for this connection lies in the silent language of form. Both Valdivia and Jōmon figurines share a specific aesthetic vocabulary. They often depict female forms with similar hairstyles, like a bob cut or a top knot. Their arms are frequently crossed over the chest in an identical posture. The method of manufacture, using coiled clay ropes to build the figure, is a shared technical approach. Most strikingly, the timeline aligns. The earliest Valdivia pottery appears around 3,000 years before the Common Era, just as certain Jōmon pottery styles were reaching their peak in Japan. For proponents, this was not mere parallel development. It was a signature of contact, a cultural fingerprint left by visitors from across the sea. They argued that such a specific and complex artistic package was unlikely to be invented independently twice. The vast Pacific, in this view, was not an empty void but a potential highway, navigated by skilled mariners in sturdy boats long before recorded history. Mainstream archaeology, however, remains deeply skeptical of this trans-Pacific leap. The counterargument is a powerful testament to the concept of independent invention. Scholars point out that the basic human form offers a limited range of natural artistic expression. A coiled clay technique is a logical, simple method for building a small sculpture that many cultures could discover on their own. The crossed arm pose is a natural, resting position for the human body. They argue that similar environmental challenges and social needs, like the development of settled communities and ritual practices, can lead to strikingly similar solutions in art, even in complete isolation. This is the principle of convergence, where cultures arrive at analogous ideas without any contact whatsoever. Furthermore, no other Japanese artifacts, like tools or distinctively Jōmon settlement remains, have ever been found in Valdivia sites. The connection rests solely on a stylistic impression, without the supporting evidence of trade goods or genetic markers that would cement a physical link. The debate between diffusion and independent invention is one of the oldest in archaeology. The Valdivia figurines sit at its heart, a beautiful enigma. They force us to ask a fundamental question about human creativity. Is our artistic expression so uniquely cultural that similarities must indicate a shared source? Or are there universal human gestures and techniques that will naturally emerge whenever people begin to shape clay into figures of meaning? These small clay people from Ecuador hold no written records. They simply exist, their forms echoing across an ocean and through millennia, leaving us to wonder if their resemblance is a message from a lost voyage or a profound reminder of the shared artistic spirit that can arise in any human community, anywhere on Earth. Beneath the dense forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula lies a scar on the Earth, a testament to an industrial effort of staggering, ancient scale. The Keweenaw Peninsula, jutting into Lake Superior, is pockmarked with thousands of pits and trenches, some over 20 feet deep. These are not natural formations. They are the remnants of the world's largest prehistoric copper mines, worked not with modern machinery, but with stone hammers, fire, and immense human labor, beginning over 7,000 years ago. For centuries, indigenous peoples quarried the pure, elemental copper that lay in astonishing abundance just beneath the surface. The scale of their enterprise is almost incomprehensible. Archaeologists estimate that over 500,000 tons of copper ore were removed, yielding millions of pounds of pure, malleable metal. Yet here is the profound and enduring mystery. Where did it all go? Only a tiny fraction of this copper has ever been found in North American archaeological sites. The vast majority simply vanished from the continent's record. This absence points to a single, breathtaking possibility. The copper of Lake Superior was a global commodity. The most compelling theory, supported by modern science, is that this copper traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, fueling the very civilizations of the European Bronze Age. This idea moves from speculation toward evidence through a process called trace element analysis. Just as a fingerprint is unique, copper from a specific geographic source carries a distinct chemical signature, a blend of trace impurities like arsenic, silver, and nickel. When scientists analyzed the composition of Bronze Age copper artifacts found in Europe and the Mediterranean, a surprising pattern emerged. Many of these artifacts, from axes to ingots, matched the unique chemical fingerprint of the Lake Superior mines. This is not a perfect match for every artifact, but the correlation is too strong to dismiss as coincidence. It suggests that a significant portion of the metal that built the tools, weapons, and ornaments of ancient European societies originated from a source thousands of miles away in the heart of North America. The logistical challenge this presents is immense. How could tons of raw copper travel such an impossible distance in an age before written records of transatlantic travel? The answer likely lies in a relay race of trade, not a single direct voyage. The copper could have been worked into portable ingots or tools on the shores of Lake Superior. From there, it may have begun a slow, incremental journey eastward through the continent's vast indigenous trade networks, passing from hand to hand over generations. These networks, as we've seen, were capable of moving goods across astonishing distances. Eventually, the copper could have reached the Atlantic coast, perhaps in the Canadian Maritimes or New England. There, the final, most speculative leg of the journey begins. Could maritime traders from Europe, perhaps early Basque whalers or even Bronze Age explorers from the British Isles, have encountered these coastal trading posts? They would have recognized the metal's incredible purity and value immediately. In this scenario, the copper was not mined by Europeans but traded for, completing a supply chain that spanned an ocean and rewired our understanding of the ancient global economy. This theory transforms the quiet pits of Michigan from a local wonder into a potential linchpin of Old World civilization. It suggests that the flourishing of societies around the Mediterranean was indirectly supported by the labor of miners in a distant, forested land they never knew. The copper mines of Lake Superior stand as a silent monument not to isolation, but to connection, a hidden node in a web of exchange so vast it quietly tied together the destinies of two separate worlds, long before either world knew the other's name. The quest for copper leads us across a continent, but another discovery points to a journey across the greatest ocean of all. On the arid coast of Chile, at a site called El Arenal, archaeologists unearthed a collection of bones that seemed perfectly ordinary. They were chicken bones found within the remains of a settlement that thrived long before any Spanish conquistador set foot in the region. In the grand narrative of global contact, this should have been impossible. Chickens, like horses and cattle, were old-world animals brought by Europeans to the Americas. Yet when researchers subjected these particular bones to radiocarbon dating, the results were unequivocal. These chickens lived and died in South America sometime between the years 1300 and 1420. At least a century before Columbus's voyage and likely decades before any sustained European presence. The timeline itself was a shock, but the true revelation lay in the bones' genetic blueprint. Scientists extracted ancient DNA from the remains and compared it to genetic sequences from chicken populations around the world. The match was definitive and astonishing. The El Arenal chickens were not related to European breeds at all. Their closest genetic relatives were chickens from Polynesia, the island cultures scattered across the vast central and southern Pacific. This single, humble bone fragment became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for pre-Columbian transoceanic contact ever found. It is not an ambiguous artifact or a stylistic similarity. It is the biological remains of a domesticated animal, carrying an immutable genetic passport that traces its lineage directly back across thousands of miles of open sea. The implication is as clear as it is profound. Polynesian voyagers, the greatest navigators in human history, reached the coast of South America. They did not come as conquerors or colonists, but likely as explorers or traders, and they brought with them a vital piece of their own world, the chicken, a source of food and likely cultural significance. This contact, however brief, left a living trace in the archaeological record. This discovery solves a long-standing botanical mystery that flows in the opposite direction. For centuries, scholars have puzzled over the sweet potato. This starchy tuber is a crop native to South America. Yet, by the time European explorers arrived in the Pacific in the 18th century, they found the sweet potato, known by names like kumara, already established and thriving across Polynesia, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. How did a new world plant cross the Pacific Ocean before Columbus? The presence of Polynesian chickens in Chile provides the missing link. It establishes that a two-way exchange was not only possible but probable. Polynesian voyagers having reached South America would have encountered the sweet potato. Recognizing its value as a hardy, nutritious crop perfect for long ocean voyages and island cultivation, they would have taken cuttings or tubers aboard their great double-hulled canoes for the return journey. The sweet potato then spread across the Pacific Islands, carried by the very people who had bridged the world's greatest ocean. This creates a beautiful, reciprocal picture of contact. The Polynesians brought the chicken to the Americas, and they took the sweet potato home. It was not a conquest but an exchange, a meeting of cultures that swapped biological treasures. The evidence of the chicken bones, backed by solid radiocarbon dates and genetic data, transforms a speculative theory into a near certainty. It tells a story of incredible human skill and courage, of voyages undertaken across trackless waters using only the stars, the waves, and profound knowledge of the natural world. It shows us that the map of human connection was already complete, its lines drawn not in ink, but in the movement of a humble bird and a resilient root, silently rewriting our understanding of who knew the world and when. Scattered across the wooded hills and farmlands of New England are structures that feel transplanted from another time and place. These are not grand pyramids or towering temples, but low, intimate chambers built entirely from unmortared stone. Their walls curve inward as they rise, meeting at a capstone to form a perfect beehive shape. They are often tucked into hillsides or nestled beside streams, hidden in plain sight. To anyone familiar with ancient European architecture, their form is instantly recognizable, bearing a striking resemblance to the early Christian oratories built by Irish monks, known as culdees, between the 6th and 9th centuries. This uncanny similarity has fueled a captivating theory that these stone chambers are not colonial leftovers, but the sacred spaces of pre-Columbian European visitors, perhaps Irish monks sailing across the Atlantic in fragile leather curraghs centuries before the Vikings. The romantic appeal of this idea is powerful. It suggests a quiet, spiritual colonization, a mission not of conquest but of solitary faith, leaving behind these stone prayers in the wilderness. Proponents point to the chamber's precise astronomical alignments, with doorways often oriented to the solstice sunrise or important stars, a feature common in Celtic sacred sites. They argue that the construction technique, using massive lintels and corbelled arches, is too sophisticated for simple colonial farm storage and mirrors old world methods exactly. Mainstream archaeology, however, listens to a different story told by the stones themselves. The consensus among most researchers is that these chambers are almost certainly colonial-era root cellars, built by 17th and 18th century settlers. The design, while ancient in origin, is also remarkably practical. A beehive shape is structurally sound for underground storage, providing a cool, stable environment perfect for preserving vegetables through harsh New England winters. Historical records and deeds often reference such cellars on farmsteads, and in many cases, the chambers are found in direct association with colonial property boundaries and homestead foundations. The astronomical alignments, skeptics note, could be coincidental or functional. A doorway facing the southeast simply catches the morning sun to reduce dampness. Furthermore, no artifacts of definitively European pre-Columbian origin have been found within these chambers that cannot be explained by later colonial use. An alternative and equally valid interpretation is that some chambers may be of Native American construction. Northeastern tribes, particularly the Algonquian peoples, were skilled stoneworkers who built hunting blinds, ceremonial spaces, and storage pits. A stone chamber could easily fit within this indigenous architectural tradition, designed for practical or spiritual purposes that were later misunderstood by European settlers. This debate makes the New England stone chambers a perfect case study in a fundamental archaeological challenge. How do we distinguish unusual indigenous innovation from potential outsider influence? When we encounter something that looks familiar to our own cultural memory, our first instinct is to connect it to a known source. The beehive shape is a classic example of convergent engineering, a smart, simple solution to a universal problem, creating a stable roof without wood that can be invented independently across the globe. The chambers force us to confront our biases. Do we label them as Celtic because that story feels exciting and connects two hemispheres? Or do we accept the more mundane, documented explanation of colonial agriculture? Perhaps the truth is layered, with some chambers being colonial cellars built on a timeless design, and others being genuinely ancient, their origins lost. These silent stone rooms hold no inscriptions, no buried treasures to provide a clear answer. They simply sit, their curved walls a mirror, reflecting our own desire to find familiar patterns in a landscape, reminding us that the most enduring mysteries are often those that blur the line between the known world and the imagination of those who came before. The silent stones of New England present a mystery of form and origin, but in the sun-baked soil of central Mexico, a collection of artifacts emerged that challenged not just history, but our entire understanding of life on Earth. In the 1940s, a German merchant named Waldemar Jolsrud claimed to have made an astonishing discovery near the town of Acámbaro. According to his account, he found thousands of small ceramic figurines buried in the ground. These were not typical representations of local gods or animals. Instead, they depicted human figures engaged in everyday activities alongside, and sometimes even riding, creatures that looked unmistakably like dinosaurs. There were triceratops, stegosaurs, and pterodactyls rendered in a stylized but recognizable form. If these objects were authentic ancient artifacts, their implication was earth-shattering. They would suggest that a pre-Columbian civilization had either lived alongside dinosaurs or possessed an uncanny, inexplicable knowledge of creatures that had been extinct for 65 million years. The academic world reacted with immediate and almost universal dismissal. To archaeologists, the Acámbaro figures were an obvious and frankly clumsy modern hoax. The figurines showed no weathering or patina consistent with great age in that soil. Their artistic style was crude and inconsistent with any known Mesoamerican tradition. Furthermore, the very concept was scientifically impossible, flying in the face of everything known about geology, paleontology, and human history. The consensus was clear. This was a fabrication, likely created by local artisans for sale to an eager collector, playing on popular fascination with dinosaurs that was widespread in the mid-20th century. Yet the story did not end there. Decades later, proponents of the figure's authenticity sought to prove their case with modern science. They submitted samples for thermoluminescence dating, a method that determines the last time clay was fired. Some of these tests reportedly returned dates of antiquity, suggesting the figures were fired thousands of years ago. This claim became the cornerstone of a persistent alternative narrative, arguing that mainstream science was ignoring hard evidence to protect a flawed paradigm. The scientific community's rejection of these dating results is rooted in the fundamental principles of archaeology. First, context is everything. The figures were not discovered by professional archaeologists in a controlled, documented dig. They were reportedly found by a single individual, and their original burial context, the soil layer, the associated artifacts, the stratigraphy, was never scientifically recorded. This makes it impossible to verify they were truly ancient in situ. Second, thermoluminescence dating, while powerful, is not infallible. The method can be skewed if the samples were exposed to sunlight or heat after their original firing, which would reset the clock. If the figures were a modern hoax, the test would simply date when the forger baked them. More critically, the burden of proof for such an extraordinary claim is immense. A single line of evidence, especially one from artifacts with a questionable provenance, is not enough to overturn multiple, interlocking fields of established science. The existence of dinosaurs is confirmed by fossilized bones in specific geological strata, not by ceramic art. Human history is charted through a continuous, contextual archaeological record. The Acámbaro figures fit into neither framework. They are a powerful lesson in how we evaluate evidence. Extraordinary claims do not just require evidence, they require extraordinary evidence that is robust, reproducible, and found within a verifiable context. This case highlights the tension between a compelling story and the meticulous, often less dramatic, work of building historical understanding piece by verified piece. The figurines remain a curious cultural artifact, a testament not to ancient contact with dinosaurs, but to the enduring human fascination with mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of the known world. A castle in Japan holds coins from the heart of the Roman Empire. On the subtropical island of Okinawa, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Katsuren Castle, a medieval fortress of the Ryukyu Kingdom, made a startling find. Mixed within the soil layers of this 15th century site were several small, worn metal discs. After careful cleaning and analysis, experts identified them without question. They were genuine Roman coins, silver denarii and gold aurae, minted between the 3rd and 4th centuries. This discovery, thousands of miles from Rome and over 1,000 years after the coins were struck, presented a geographical and historical riddle of the highest order. The immediate, dramatic question was whether this implied Roman legions or merchants had somehow reached the shores of Japan. The answer, while less cinematic, is far more revealing about the astonishing, interconnected world of ancient trade. These coins did not arrive from a Roman galley sailing into a Japanese port. Instead, their journey is a masterclass in the indirect, patient movement of objects across the globe. Rome's economic influence stretched eastward through legendary routes. Roman merchants traded extensively for silk, spices, and gems via the Silk Road, which connected to the great empires of Persia, India, and eventually China. Roman glassware and coins have been found in archaeological sites across Southeast Asia. From there, goods moved through maritime networks in the South China Sea and along the coasts. The Ryukyu Kingdom, centered on Okinawa, was a vibrant hub in this later period, a crossroads for maritime trade between Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. A Roman coin, arriving in China as a curious trinket or a piece of bullion through these long overland and sea routes, could have been traded and retraded for centuries. It might have been valued not as currency, but as an exotic piece of art, a charm, or simply as precious metal. Over generations, it slowly traveled north and east through the hands of merchants and diplomats, eventually finding its way to the royal court or a wealthy collector at Katsuren Castle. This path rewrites our understanding not of Roman exploration, but of Roman reach. It proves that an object from the Mediterranean could circulate through such an extended and resilient chain of human connection that it could eventually come to rest in a place its makers could not have conceived of on any map. The coins are silent witnesses to a world where value and curiosity flowed along invisible channels linking empires that officially knew nothing of each other. They turn the map of the ancient world into a living web, where a gold coin minted for an emperor in Rome could, centuries later, be held in the hand of a noble on a distant Pacific island, both ends of a thread woven across continents and seas. While a single coin can travel through endless hands, an entire village leaves a story written in the earth. On the windswept northern tip of Newfoundland, a place the Norse called Vinland, the ground held a secret for 1,000 years. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad followed a hunch drawn from ancient Icelandic sagas. tales of voyages to a western land of wild grapes and shallow waters. Their search led them to a grassy terrace at Epaves Bay near the village of Elance aux Meadows. What they began to uncover there was not a suggestive artifact or a debated inscription, but something far more substantial: the faint, geometric outlines of buildings buried beneath the turf. This was the lost Viking settlement, the first and only confirmed Norse site in North America, and its discovery did something remarkable. It transformed legend into verified history, rewriting the global timeline with the undeniable weight of proof. The archaeological evidence was both subtle and overwhelming. Carefully peeling back the sod, the team revealed the foundations of 8 distinct structures. These were not temporary shelters, but sturdy Norse-style longhouses built with walls of layered turf stacked over a timber frame, designed to withstand the harsh Atlantic winters. The largest hall stretched nearly 90 feet in length, a communal space that could have housed dozens of people. Within and around these buildings, the soil yielded the quiet, everyday debris of life. They found a stone oil lamp, a bronze pin for fastening a cloak, a small spindle whorl for spinning wool, and the kind of iron boat rivets that were the unmistakable signature of Viking shipbuilding. Perhaps most telling was the discovery of a simple iron smithy, complete with a forge and slag, the waste product from working metal. This proved the Norse were not just visiting, they were preparing to stay and repair their ships, turning local bog iron into the nails and tools they needed to survive in this new world. The significance of Elance aux Meadows cannot be overstated. Before its excavation, the Viking voyages to North America were considered just that, compelling sagas but ultimately unproven legends, often grouped with other speculative tales of pre-Columbian contact. This site changed everything. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement squarely around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus. Here was concrete, archaeological proof that Europeans had not only reached the American continent, but had established a foothold, however brief. It validated the Icelandic sagas as historical documents containing kernels of truth, and it instantly redrew the map of the ancient Atlantic world. This was no longer a theory, it was a fact etched into the landscape. The settlement appears to have been active for only a short period, perhaps a decade or two, before being abandoned. The reasons are lost to time, but the legacy is permanent. Elance aux Meadows stands as a silent sentinel, a foundational piece of evidence that forever shattered the myth of a 1492 starting line, proving the human drive to explore had connected these shores far earlier than our textbooks ever dared to claim. Rising from the ocean's edge near Rio de Janeiro is a mountain that seems to hold a message. Pedra do Gavia, a monolithic peak overlooking the city, is not just a natural wonder. On its sheer granite face, observers for centuries have pointed to a series of deep grooves and weathered markings that, from a distance, appear to form deliberate characters. Some have even described the silhouette of the entire mountaintop as resembling a colossal, weathered human face gazing out to sea. To those who believe in pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages, these features are not random. They have been interpreted as ancient inscriptions, possibly carved by Phoenician or Canaanite explorers thousands of years ago, a monumental claim etched into the very skyline of Brazil. The specific markings pointed to are a collection of vertical and horizontal grooves on a western cliff. Proponents of the inscription theory argue these grooves are too geometrically regular to be natural, suggesting they form letters in a Semitic script. They see in the lines and angles a potential dedication to a Phoenician king or a navigational marker for ancient sailors, a permanent record of discovery on a scale meant to be seen from the sea. This interpretation fits a compelling narrative of intrepid explorers from the Old World leaving their mark on a new continent, a story written not on parchment but on a mountain. Mainstream geology and archaeology, however, hear a very different story in the stone. experts who have studied Pedra do Gavia closely conclude that the celebrated markings are almost certainly the result of natural processes. Granite, the rock that forms the mountain, is prone to a specific type of erosion called exfoliation. As the rock expands and contracts with temperature changes, and as water seeps into microscopic cracks and freezes, thin sheets of stone peel away. This process often creates straight, geometric fractures and grooves that can look astonishingly artificial. The parallel lines and right angles that some see as script are, in this view, simply the signature of time, weather, and the inherent properties of the stone itself. The mountain's famous face is similarly explained as a classic example of pareidolia, the powerful and universal human tendency to perceive familiar patterns, especially faces, in random shapes. We see it in clouds, in the surface of the moon, and in the stains on a wall. Our brains are wired to find meaning, to impose order on chaos. When we look at a majestic, complex natural formation like Pedra do Gavia, it is almost instinctual to search for a figure, a message, a sign of intelligent design. This makes the mountain a perfect case study in the psychology of discovery. The debate over Pedra do Gavia is less about the markings themselves and more about how we choose to see the world. It represents the eternal tension between two human impulses, the desire to find connection and meaning across vast stretches of time and space, and the disciplined, often less romantic, work of scientific explanation. One interpretation offers a thrilling link to ancient mariners, a lost chapter of global history. The other offers a profound lesson in the artistry of nature and the fascinating quirks of our own perception. The mountain does not give up its secret easily. It stands as a silent Rorschach test in stone, reflecting back not only the erosive power of wind and rain, but also our deep, enduring need for the past to speak to us in a language we long to understand. The search for lost tribes can sometimes create exactly what it seeks to find. In the late 1800s, Michigan became the stage for one of the most audacious and perplexing archaeological frauds in American history. It began with a series of remarkable discoveries by a man named James Scotford, a self-proclaimed archaeologist and dowser. Across the state, from farm fields to burial mounds, Scotford and later his associate Daniel Soper unearthed a staggering collection of artifacts. There were thousands of small, inscribed slate tablets, delicate clay pipes, and copper tools, all seemingly ancient, but their subject matter was what made them extraordinary. The tablets were covered in intricate carvings depicting scenes straight from the Bible figures of Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, and characters resembling ancient Egyptians and Israelites. Even more astonishing, the inscriptions were said to be written in a bewildering array of ancient Old World scripts, Egyptian hieroglyphs, cuneiform, and Greek. It was as if a museum of the ancient Near East had been buried in the heart of the Midwest, suggesting that the lost tribes of Israel had not only reached America, but had settled and thrived there long before Columbus. The public and many eager antiquarians were captivated. This was the era of the mound builder myth, a widespread belief that the sophisticated earthworks found across the eastern United States were too advanced to have been built by Native Americans and must be the work of a lost, possibly Old World civilization. The Michigan Relics, as they became known, seemed to offer spectacular proof, perfectly aligning with popular theories and religious expectations of the time. They promised to rewrite history, connecting the sacred narrative of the Bible directly to the American landscape. Professional archaeologists, however, were immediately and profoundly suspicious. From the very first examinations, the relics were riddled with glaring problems. The inscriptions were a chaotic jumble, mixing symbols from different languages and time periods in ways no genuine ancient scribe ever would. Egyptian hieroglyphs were placed next to Greek letters in nonsensical sequences. The artifacts themselves showed no signs of legitimate weathering. the inscribed lines on the slate were often suspiciously fresh and sharp, lacking the patina of centuries. The objects appeared precisely where Scotford and Soper were digging, and never under the watchful eye of a trained observer. As scholars from institutions like the University of Michigan and the Smithsonian began to systematically dismantle the claims, the fraud unraveled. They demonstrated how the slate could be easily carved with common tools and artificially aged with acid. They exposed the methods of the forgers, who likely created the objects in a workshop and then planted them for discovery. By the early 20th century, the academic consensus was unanimous and damning. The Michigan relics were an elaborate, prolific hoax, a fabrication designed to exploit contemporary fascination and turn a profit from the sale of these priceless antiquities. Yet the story of these forgeries is far more than a tale of deception. It serves as a crucial, cautionary chapter in the history of archaeology itself. The relics highlight how powerfully our desires and preconceptions can shape what we think we find. In an era hungry for a grand, unifying origin story that linked America to biblical history, these objects provided a seemingly perfect answer. They show that the line between discovery and invention can become dangerously blurred when the hunger for a certain truth outweighs the discipline of evidence. Furthermore, these forgeries have had a lasting, complicating effect on the search for genuine pre-Columbian contact. Whenever a legitimate, puzzling artifact emerges, like the Bat Creek stone or the Paraíba inscription, skeptics can rightly point to the Michigan relics as an example of how easily the public and even experts can be misled. The shadow of such a massive fraud forces archaeologists to be even more rigorous, their standards even higher, which is ultimately a good thing for the pursuit of real knowledge. But it also means that truly anomalous finds face an uphill battle, guilty by association in a field once burned by grand lies. The Michigan relics stand as a monument not to ancient contact but to a very human longing. They remind us that our search for the past is always a conversation between what lies buried in the earth and what we hope to find there, a dialogue where sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones we are all too eager to write for ourselves. So where does this leave our story of the world? We have wandered from stone towers to sunken ships, from Roman coins in Japanese castles to Polynesian chickens in Chilean soil. 20 separate puzzles, each a piece of a mosaic so vast we are still assembling its edges. Some of these pieces, like the Michigan relics, are almost certainly false, clever forgeries that speak more to our desires than to ancient reality. Others, like the Acámbaro figures, are likely profound misreadings of natural forms or modern creations. This careful sifting is not a failure of imagination, it is the very heart of the process. Rewriting history is not done with a bold declaration, but with the patient collective weight of evidence where each new find is questioned, tested, and only slowly woven into the fabric of what we know to be true. And that is what makes the remaining discoveries so powerful. The verified settlement at Elance Aux Meadows, the genetic passport of the El Arenal chickens, the chemical signature of Lake Superior copper in European bronze, these are not speculations. They are credible scientific anchors that pull the timeline of human connection firmly backward, proving that our ancestors' horizons were far wider than our records once showed. They force a fundamental re-evaluation. We can no longer view ancient civilizations as isolated lanterns burning in separate darkness. Instead, we must see them as part of a dimly lit network, where ideas, goods, and perhaps even people moved across oceans and continents in fits and starts, through voyages forgotten and trade routes now silent. This does not diminish the awesome, independent achievements of cultures from the Olmec to the Polynesians. It enriches them, placing them within a more dynamic, interconnected human story. The true impact of these 20 discoveries, then, is not a simple new map with clear routes drawn. it is the gift of a deeper, more humbling mystery. They remind us that the drive to explore, to trade, to see what lies beyond the horizon is a thread woven into our species long before empires kept chronicles. Every anomalous coin, every out-of-place artifact is an echo of that timeless curiosity. They challenge us to hold two ideas at once, to maintain rigorous skepticism while embracing wondrous possibility. As the Earth continues to yield its secrets, what future discoveries might wait, buried in a farmer's field or resting in the deep sea, ready to further reshape our understanding of this beautifully, endlessly connected human past. The story is not finished. We are still turning the pages.